meeting convened by Diaspora Alliance, an international organization dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism and its instrumentalization, and Jewish Currents magazine. Today's discussion is geared toward helping us understand the effects and dangers of how Holocaust memory is being invoked and marshaled in the present, and also how those of us who are invested in protecting the memory of the Holocaust can also be alert to its misuses. Over the past month, we've seen the history, memory, and visual iconography of the Holocaust being invoked all over the world in response to October 7th and the ongoing war in Gaza. Last week, the Brandenburg Gate was emblazoned with the statement, "Never again is now." And the attacks have widely been referred to as the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Not only are the actual events of the Holocaust being deployed as analogies for the current situation, but so too is the very idea of Holocaust memory. We have seen, for example, an Israeli government spokesman argue that, quote, October 7th denial is the new Holocaust denial. And for the past month, we have watched as the memory of Jewish suffering, past and present, is wielded to produce unthinkable death and destruction. I'm hoping that over the course of this conversation, we can begin to understand not only where this impulse to analogize originates, but also begin to grasp its effects. Each of the scholars joining us today have studied the legal, political, and historical contours of the genocide. Omer Bartov is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University and the author of many books interrogating the relation between total war, genocide, and anti-Semitism. His work reveals with exacting detail how genocidal violence has historically unfolded in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, and he has also written about how the memory of the Holocaust informs contemporary Israeli politics. In an opinion piece for the New York Times last week, Omer argued that we know from history that it is crucial to warn of the potential for genocide before it occurs, rather than belatedly condemn it after it has taken place. I think we still have that time, he wrote. Yelena Subotic is a professor of political science at Georgia State University, whose work engages with memory politics, human rights, transitional justice, international ethics, and state identity. Her recent book, Yellow Star, Red Star, analyzes practices of Holocaust remembrance and the appropriation of Holocaust memory in Eastern Europe after communism. She is also the editor of a new volume on the social science of the Holocaust. Raz Sigal is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University, whose work documents how the Holocaust unfolded in the Carpathian region. Earlier this month, his article, A Textbook Case of Genocide, published in Jewish Currents, argued that not only is Israel's campaign against Gaza yet another chapter in the Nakba, but also that it clearly fits the definition of genocide according to international law. My name is Linda Kinsler. I'm the author of Come to This Court and Cry, How the Holocaust Ends, and I'm also a contributing writer to Jewish Currents magazine. Before we begin, I also want to encourage our audience to sign up both for the Diaspora Alliance newsletter and for the Jewish Currents newsletter, as well as to visit the magazine's website where you can see all of our coverage of recent events. So the first question, Omer, I'm going to go to you. And I'm wondering if you can begin by speaking to how Holocaust memory has been historically deployed as part of Israeli national discourse and state building, and speak to how you have seen that history informing the rhetoric that is coming out of Israel in the present.
So thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you to all the people who are listening to us. I would actually start before the Holocaust, because we have to understand that one of the main roots of Zionism as a Jewish national movement was anti-Semitism in Europe. The other one was obviously the rise of nationalism, and especially ethno-nationalism in Eastern Europe. So in that sense, I would say that built, in a sense, into the DNA of Zionism and then the early pre-state community in Palestine is already a sense that that community is a response to violence against Jews, to anti-Semitism and to pogroms. And then in the wake of the Holocaust, also with the arrival of many hundreds of thousands of survivors of the Holocaust into Israel, that becomes part of the human terrain in Israel. But the use of the Holocaust itself as an event that has become a major component of Israeli national identity takes a while. It doesn't happen right away, not right after 1948. And I would say that the beginning of it is the Eichmann trial in the early 1960s, when for the first time the Holocaust in its details is presented to the Israeli public with the kind of educational goal of teaching the youth what their national identity is all about and how they differ from those Jews who, so to speak, went like sheep to the slaughter. Politically, it takes even longer than that. And I would say that it's only in the wake of the War of 1973 and increasingly in the 1980s that the Holocaust comes to be a major slogan for Israeli governments. And the various telling moments, perhaps one of the best or worst, if you like, is when Menachem Begin speaks about Arafat then in besieged Beirut, and there's some echoes to the present situation, as Hitler hiding in his bunker. That immediately evokes a whole set of associations in the minds of Israelis, and making all kinds of connotations, many of which, of course, are ahistorical, but are nonetheless resonate very powerfully in a sort of general Israeli psyche. And at present, this has become, I think, a major element in the arsenal of the current government, which is trying to cover up for its own huge debacle on October 7th. And here, I think we have two components that are really important to consider. One is that the Hamas attack on October 7th was an absolutely atrocious, heinous act that had echoes with what people associate with pogroms, with the Holocaust and so forth, and was the single largest slaughter of Jewish civilians, it appears, since World War II. And that has echoed tremendously in Israel. It's extraordinary to see how people, without being directed by state propaganda or anything, have responded to that. So that's one side of it. The second aspect of it is that as a result, any sensitivity or worry shown regarding what Israel is engaged in now in Gaza is immediately translated into denialism. So while, in a sense, trying to deny what is happening in Gaza, and very little of it is being shown on Israeli screens, most Israeli citizens see very little of it. At the same time, while that is being denied, any mention of it is perceived as denial of the massacre of October 7th, and therefore of denial of Jewish victimhood, and therefore denial of the Holocaust. So there's a kind of cascading set of images. And I think when we talk about this, we have to keep all of this in mind. And it's not only from the top, it's something that has been internalized by many Israeli citizens, including very much, and interestingly, I would say, from a sort of ethnographic point of view, also among many members of the Israeli left.
That's so interesting. And I do appreciate how you kind of spoke to the kind of cascading set of images and these threats of denial, which for me personally have been very difficult to hear, even as we see quite consistent denials of what is going on in Gaza coming from Israeli authorities. And I do think this kind of leads us naturally to the next question, which was for you, Yelena, because you have written about how Holocaust memory has been deployed to secure political legitimacy in contemporary Europe. And I'm wondering if you can speak to how you have kind of seen this push against Holocaust denial and the invocation of Holocaust memory playing out currently in European capitals, with the kind of Brandenburg Gate, never again is now phenomenon. And I'm curious to hear both how you have seen this kind of rhetoric coming out of European politicians as well as in diaspora communities on the continent.
Sure, thank you. And thanks again for organizing this and for inviting me. So I first want to say what I mean by Holocaust memory providing political legitimacy for European states. First to explain that, and then I'll say a few things about what's playing out in European capitals. I think the case of Germany obviously is the most interesting one. So my whole premise here is that when we talk about public Holocaust memory, so not private memory of individuals and families, but public Holocaust memory, and that is memory represented in museums or official commemorative practices or history books. My premise is that today that public Holocaust memory is often largely decoupled from the Holocaust itself, and instead it serves contemporary state political needs. This is what I mean by legitimacy. It situates the political memory of the Holocaust, situates these national narratives and national biographies on a kind of spectrum where nations see themselves either as heroes or as resistors or as victims and those who suffered. And those kinds of public narratives then avoid the possibility of collaboration, perpetration, or genocidal intent. Everybody is a victim. Everybody was a resistor. Everybody was hiding their Jews all over Europe. I mean, that's kind of bottom line what I'm talking about here. And so my argument really has been that Holocaust memory is then used to put forward these very contemporary national narratives of your own contemporary national identity today, also to create new kinds of domestic and international coalitions and partnerships. And I've written about how Israeli far right has used these international coalitions with seemingly very anti-Semitic governments, such as, for example, the ones in Hungary, and how these then processes serve particular foreign policy decisions, both of Israel and of these European countries. So my interest has always been in kind of a dialogue between West European memory of the Holocaust and East European memory of the Holocaust. And I think they're quite different for obvious reasons. And I think that is important for us to understand because we might see also different reactions to what's been going on in Israel and Gaza across different parts of Europe. I also think that the way that in Western Europe, a lot of the public memory of the Holocaust has this kind of self-congratulatory aspect of it. It's often helped by the continuing Holocaust revisionism that exists in large parts of East and Central Europe. And so, what I mean by this is the more the far right in Poland or Hungary denies realities of the Holocaust and specifically denies perpetration and collaboration of Poles or Hungarians or Lithuanians in the Holocaust, the more those in the West can say how much more superior their behavior was in World War II. So that dialogue, I think plays until today. And so finally, I want to say a little bit about another way in which Holocaust memory in contemporary Europe, especially in the West, has also served as a type of screen memory that covers the responsibility of some of these countries from their own atrocities, obviously in colonial period. And so a lot has been written about how the self-congratulatory narrative about how everybody resisted the Nazis, during the Holocaust then covers any interest in memorializing and admitting your complicity and even admitting that colonialism was a crime of its own. And so we see this a lot in the context of Germany, for example. And especially I think Germany is interesting here because it has developed, again, a particular kind of self-congratulatory, almost national pride in how uniquely well the German nation dealt with its criminal legacies, but of the Holocaust, not in its criminal legacies of German colonialism in the 19th century. And that, I think, has fueled almost a new form of German nationalism of superiority that manifests itself as kind of memory championship. We're the champions of memory. We do this so much better than everybody else. And, this is not a uniquely German phenomenon. This has happened in other places as well, but I think it explains to a large extent the really troubling features of contemporary Holocaust memory that we see in Germany, which is really very bluntly been used to foreclose any debate about the complexities, both of the Holocaust itself, but also the complexities of the current situation in Israel. And we all know the blunt force with which all sorts of speech and action, political, cultural, academic, artistic, has been policed in Germany and really presented this very, very flattening view where any speech that can be perceived as criticizing Israel is by default anti-Semitic, which is really, diaspora alliance exists to question that whole premise. So I think within that context, I think it makes it a little bit more clear why there's been a particular type of invocation of the Holocaust, especially in Germany and the Gate that you mentioned, where everything goes back to the Holocaust. There's one view of the Holocaust. We know in Germany how to memorize the Holocaust, and we know, and we are the only ones who properly know what is going on. And I think that has produced some really paradoxical and kind of pathological responses.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Yelena. And I appreciate your description of the kind of blunt force that is used to foreclose debate, but also we could argue to blind us to other kinds of genocides that are ongoing in the present, to kind of elevate this form of memory above all else, and also to kind of combat the very real, as you said, threat of Holocaust revisionism and denialism from certain countries in Eastern Europe as well. And that leads me, Roz, to ask you, you wrote this piece warning of a genocide ongoing in Gaza, and since then, 800 scholars and public figures have joined you in sounding the alarm. And you have also cautioned against Israeli leaders weaponizing the Holocaust in their public remarks, and we provided a few examples, although unfortunately there are many of them in the event description. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you have witnessed this kind of weaponization of the rhetoric of Holocaust memory at work in the present. And since you wrote the piece, how have you kind of seen the situation evolve? And Omer, I also kind of want to bring you in here because I know you have also addressed this question head on, including in your recent piece for the New York Times.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for joining. And it's an honor to speak alongside you, Yelena and Omer, and also you, Linda. I think that the situation has become worse, of course, since that piece that I wrote in The Guardian. And I see that, the weaponization of the Holocaust, I see it unfolding in three main ways. One is this kind of historical decontextualized mechanism, as you mentioned, Omer, of portraying basically Israel now as facing a genocidal assault by Hamas, which also means that Hamas, and by implications, Palestinians are Nazis, right? Now, besides the fact that this is, of course, completely false, right? It's also absolutely decontextualized, and it's worth just to stress that Jews during World War II were stateless, powerless people who faced one of the strongest armies and states at the time, Nazi Germany and their allies, a genocidal assault by these perpetrators, whereas Israel, of course, very powerful state with a very powerful and advanced army that enjoys the support of all the Western powers, And Palestinians are stateless, powerless people under decades of Israeli settler colonialism, military occupation, siege, and various forms of mass violence. None of this takes away from the horrendous character of the Hamas mass murder on 7th of October. But context matters, and context is what shows us that this form of weaponization of portraying Israel as facing a genocidal assault and Palestinians as Nazis is completely decontextualized and false. It's also, of course, contributing factor to the dehumanization of Palestinians, portraying Palestinians as Nazis as one form of dehumanization that is very common in Israel today, but also, unfortunately, we see it in Europe, we see it here in the US. Just about, I think, a week ago, there was a congressman who said, who cautioned against humanitarian assistance to Palestinians and not to portray Palestinians as innocent, because would we portray Nazis as innocent in this way? So we see this kind of decontextualization and dehumanization also in the US, in Europe, and of course in Israel. A second way in which I see this weaponization is the way in which we need to understand what's happening now as a shock to the international legal system. And what I mean by that is the international legal system that emerged after World War II and really crystallized in the 90s was based on the idea that the Holocaust is unique and exceptional. And by application, it was based on the idea that Jews are actually unique and exceptional. Now, this is not very surprising when we think about the Judeo-Christian Western world, right, where Jews indeed play a foundational role. I mean, the Nazis thought that Jews played a foundational role. So, of course, the international legal system takes this Nazi view and turns it on its head, and now Jews play a positive foundational role. By implications for that, the self-proclaimed Jewish state is also unique and exceptional. So impunity for Israel in the international legal system was baked into it from the very beginning, right? The idea that Israel could perpetrate genocide, or actually any crime under international law for that matter, but certainly genocide, became unimaginable, became really unspeakable. And that's why we have impunity for Israel, even though we have mounting evidence for decades, right, of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, of violations of international humanitarian law, just by the fact of military occupation and siege, and so on. So the weaponization of the Holocaust now, the portrayal of Israel actually facing another Holocaust and Palestinians and Nazis is meant to uphold the system, even though what we're witnessing now unfolding in front of our eyes, this genocidal assault in front of our eyes, absolutely is a shock to the system. So this is another element of weaponization of the Holocaust in this context, and that's why we're absolutely going to see a lot of pushback against the genocide narrative, even though I think that the evidence is quite clear and it's increasing by the day. So weaponizing the Holocaust in this way supports this foundation of the international legal system. And the third way we're seeing the weaponization of the Holocaust, unfortunately, is by Holocaust scholars. And just a couple of days ago, there was a statement that dozens of Holocaust scholars, including some very central figures, signed that had no mention whatsoever of any form of Israeli mass violence, right? Complete, basically, denial of Israeli mass violence and horrendous dehumanization of Palestinians who appear in the statement only as quote unquote human shields. That's the only place, by the way, that's very common today, that Palestinians are humanized only when they're quote human shields, right? In this kind of discourse. So, and of course, a condemnation of Hamas, but again, no mention whatsoever of Israeli mass violence, participation in this dehumanization of Palestinians from the perspective of Holocaust studies. So that's unfortunately another form of weaponization of the Holocaust today that I think we should be aware of, because, and I'll end my comments with this, I think that also within Holocaust and genocide studies, what we're witnessing in front of our eyes is a shock, right? And I think there's more and more scholars who understand basically that business as usual in Holocaust and genocide studies is in a way not possible anymore. Things need to change in significant ways, because Israel did have also a special place in discussions in Holocaust and genocide studies. So weaponizing the Holocaust, as in the example of these Holocaust scholars, is also a pushback, right? And saying, no, we can basically continue as it is, everything is fine, whereas it's clear that we can't.
So yeah, thank you, and thank you, Oz. So I want to make a few very quick points that maybe we can discuss later as well. I think one issue that is important to grasp, and I'm not in Israel right now, but I'm trying to follow things very closely, both on the Israeli media and with friends and many conversations. I think what I'm struck by in looking at what's going on in Israel right now, for many Israeli citizens, there's a very profound sense of a sort of loss of sense of security, that people feel extremely insecure. Now partly it's because hundreds of thousands of people, or tens of thousands, about 150,000 people have been displaced because the rockets flying and so forth, and of course because of the events of October 7th. But it is very, it's core to what is happening now within the Israeli public, and it feeds into a kind of old-term anxiety within Israeli society that is, of course, up for grabs by various politicians, but one has to recognize it. One result of it is that because the Israeli government is completely incapable of speaking of a political horizon to what it is currently undertaking in Gaza, there's no pressure on it from the public to do so. That is because the anxiety is such that people basically want to regain their sense of security by just destroying the other side, and they don't want to think about the future, which is making what is happening in Gaza much more acceptable. Quite apart from the lack of information, not that people can't get it if they want to, but they're basically only watching, Israeli news. Now, that plays into a dehumanization of Palestinians, which is all over the place, of course, and we've seen these sort of genocidal statements by a variety of Israeli leaders talking about human animals and so forth in Gaza, and a very easy slippage between we want to destroy Hamas and we want to destroy Gaza. What is it exactly? Who are the human animals? Who are these beasts that we have to destroy? I have to say that the dehumanization, of course, didn't start there. So, and as often with propaganda in any place, it has to have some deeper roots. So the dehumanization of Palestinians in Israel goes way back. It goes back to 56 years of occupation of Palestinians, to generations of young Israelis who serve as policemen in occupied territories and create a particular image of the people that they are bossing it over. And then they come back to Tel Aviv or to wherever they Haifa and Jerusalem, and they appear like totally normal Western people. But in their experience, there is that experience of being occupying policemen, breaking into homes at 4 a.m. and so forth. So that dehumanization has much deeper roots in the occupation, in the ongoing occupation. Now, again, what is interesting here is that it's responding now to a sense that there is a growth of anti-Semitism around the world. And so that Israel is not only engaged in a war against Hamas, it's engaged in some larger project. And what helps it, of course, is that there are manifestations of anti-Semitism, including in some of the demonstrations against Israel. So it's not like everything else. It's not all invented. Some of it is real, but the whole thing then becomes a kind of general attack on Israel, and that therefore Israel has to defend itself because of a looming catastrophe. That insecurity, internal, and that sense of external danger, that the whole world is against us, this old Israeli trope, comes to play in a way where the Holocaust is always in the background, and therefore we have to do whatever we must to destroy our enemies. And everything, we have a carte blanche to do whatever is needed for that. Now, on the issue of the international legal system, I mean, I may be in some disagreement with Raz on that. I mean, I don't think that the way that the international legal system was instituted after World War II, it obviously was in response to events in the war, and that was the trigger for it, although it had much deeper roots than that. I don't think it was necessarily focused on Israel. I do think that it is now, and here I totally agree, it is now being challenged greatly. And I'd say that it's challenged because what we are looking at right now is a situation where, as I wrote in this op-ed in the New York Times, I'm still not convinced that there is genocide happening right now, and we can talk why and so forth. But there have been many statements of genocidal intent, and over the days, even since this piece came out 3-4 days ago, there are more and more indications of a clear effort of ethnic cleansing. That is that 1 million Gazans have been moved from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, and ethnic cleansing, apart from genocidal statements or statements with a genocidal content, is a very good indicator of a potential genocide. And when I was writing, when I started getting responses on what I wrote, it was very interesting for me in terms of how people respond to something like that. Interesting. Sometimes it's troubling, of course. So some of the responses were people felt that I had liberated them. That is, that I said something that they had wanted to say, but felt uncomfortable saying because they might be put under some kind of perspective that they didn't want to be seen as anti-Zionist or as not good Jews or as attacking the state of the Jews or something along that lines. And other people, not least from Israel, have seen what I wrote as treasonous. In fact, some people told me that I should be stripped of my Israeli citizenship. And so what you find is that speaking about this right now is challenging the whole paradigm of thinking about Israel. And to my mind, the events on the ground right now can actually only be resolved by a change of the political paradigm, not only of the paradigm through which we look at things, but actually the day after cannot be a day after without a major shift in paradigm, political shift of the paradigm that existed under the Netanyahu administration for at least the last 20 years.
Thank you both so much. And I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think that you are both speaking to this really difficult paradigm or paradox where, as you say, both the law of the state of Israel and the system of international law is kind of built in order to prevent genocide from recurring. And we are seeing kind of not only that system being invoked in the present, even as it is being kind of evacuated of all meaning and shown to be absolutely powerless to prevent genocide from occurring. And I think, Omer, your point, and Raz, what you said that, this is a textbook case of genocide, and what Omer is saying that there is a kind of ethnic cleansing going on, and there is still the potential for genocide. Those are kind of things that call for us to be alert to its potential, no matter if it has already occurred or if it's going to occur next week, and I want to kind of open up this question to all of our panelists, and kind of continuing on this thread, I wonder if you can all help us understand, it's not only this genocidal, dehumanizing language that we're seeing coming out of Israel, but it's also the kind of direct comparison of Hamas fighters to Nazis. And that kind of language is being wielded to alter the public perception of this war. So I'm wondering if you can all speak to how you see that language operating, and how we are to understand it, and how those kinds of words and direct comparisons are being invoked, and how we should kind of respond to them, how we should be responsible with such analogies. How are we to make sense of them?
Who should respond?
Yelena, I don't know if you want to kind of jump in at this point.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure who this was directed. So clearly language matters, but also, such blunt language also flattens nuance and makes it all sound very simple. So, if Hamas are Nazis, then they have to be eradicated. How do you eradicate it? By all means necessary. I mean, it's kind of a movie set kind of plot. But things are, of course, more complicated. I have no problem as a scholar of genocide and of the Holocaust. I have no problem saying that the Hamas attacks on October 7th were pogrom. I'm very comfortable with that, because there are other pogroms other than those in the Holocaust. There were, I think we need to be intellectually consistent. And if we argue that what's going on today in Gaza on behalf of Israel has, as Omer said, genocidal intent, or at least it has genocidal ideation. That's like, to put it most generously, I guess. Then we also have to say the same for Hamas. I mean, Hamas is interested in genocide. I mean, I think that's just so obvious, and yet I think what bothers me a little bit, I guess, over time since October 7 is because the focus has been justifiably so on Gaza. There's been a little bit of a moral distance between the events of October 7 and how we refer to them, which, as I said, I'm perfectly comfortable referring to them as a genocidal pogrom. The problem, of course, is then what you do with it, and I completely agree with Omer. It's a political question. We all know this. This is there's no military solution to this. And, everybody knows this. And yet here we are. There's no military solution to this because, yes, Hamas is not Nazi Germany. Things would have been much easier in many ways if this is the conflict like that, but it's not. The solution is political one, and treating Hamas as the Nazis, or treating this problem as one that can be solved through a military operation where the cost is limitless, is of course only going to make the problem worse. I mean, again, we all know this, and at some point, I wonder if the Israeli government knows this as well, but either obviously doesn't care particularly, but also there's such a poverty of imagination that it strikes me that nobody has a plan. So it's not as if I don't even think that Bibi Netanyahu has a clear genocidal plan of killing all Palestinians. I think he has no plan, and so I think this is more, other than a systematic genocide to eradicate Palestinians, this is more kind of a vengeful fantasy. It's a revenge fantasy that is killing, tens of thousands of people. And so that's, I think, what makes it so horrifying also, is that there's no plan for how this can politically be resolved. And that's the absolute only way that this can be resolved.
Can I jump in quickly?
Yeah, please.
Is that okay?
Sure.
First of all, on using the term Nazis, it can work in two ways, I think. Obviously, it's false, and Hamas is a very unpleasant organization, and the original statement, establishing document, is in many ways genocidal. So that's not the point. But they're not Nazis. It's just two different animals. But I would say that talking about them in this manner has been used, say, by people like Netanyahu for clear incitement. What do you do with people like that? You should do to them as you did to Amalek. What are you supposed to do to Amalek? It's to kill their men, their women, and their babies. This is what the Bible says, and people who know anything about it immediately it raises that. So it's used for incitement. That's one thing. The second thing, it can be used for obfuscation, right? It's to divert attention. So you are speaking about them as Nazis, and therefore, as Yelena was saying, take your eyes off the ball of what we are now doing elsewhere, right? So they are the Nazis, and we are just protecting ourselves. But I want to say something first about the use of the term pogrom. I think that I have spoken against using this term too. I don't think it's at all appropriate. Just as we would think of, say, 9/11, was that a pogrom? No, it was a terrorist attack. And I think that the attack by Hamas was a terrorist attack. A pogrom traditionally is an incited mob, helped or not helped by the authorities, attacking a minority. This was not a minority being attacked. The Jewish state was actually the manifestation of creating a state for the Jews that has its own army, its own police, its own government. They're all Jews. And they failed to protect their own people from a terrorist attack. So, it's a screw up of the system and a successful and murderous terrorist attack. But when you say pogrom, you again sort of alluding to all kind of deep Jewish memories, and you're putting it within a series of sort of the long Jewish history of persecution. This is not part of the Jewish history of persecution. This is part of the history of Israel. Which was among the creators of Hamas as it was among the creators of Hezbollah. Much of what you see is a product of Israeli policies. That's not to condone anything that Hamas did. It was, in fact, a crime against humanity. It was, in fact, a war crime. And one might even say it was a genocidal massacre. But it's not a pogrom, and it's not part of that long history. Now, one last thing on a plan. I think that Netanyahu does have a plan, and his plan is the plan of his coalition. It failed. The original plan failed because of the Hamas attack. But what they had wanted to do was to sweep the entire Palestinian issue under the rug and to manage that conflict while creating Israel as in a series of alliances with other Arab countries. And gradually, and this was the whole point of the so-called judicial reform, absorb the West Bank, increase the settlements there, and annex it under a regime of apartheid, which is what exists there right now. That exploded in their faces, but that's what they would like to go back, and that's why they cannot talk about any alternative political plan. But it can't work. That now cannot work, and that's why they can't say what their political horizon is, because the other alternative is to actually say, okay, we cannot deal with Hamas. Hamas is totally discredited now, so it has to be removed. As you can't entirely destroy Hamas, of course, but as the hegemon in Gaza. But then you have to create a new relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. The 7 million Jews, 7 million Palestinians in that territory. You have to find a way for them to live together. That's something that this government cannot say. And therefore, what it can use is bombs, and then somehow to enclose those people again in another series of fences and continue managing this conflict. That's their plan. I think it won't work, and it's a recipe for more and more bloodshed.
Roz, I would like to hear your response, and I also just want to not miss something really important that you said earlier, which is about this kind of crisis of Holocaust and genocide studies, which kind of speaks to the broader crisis of memory that we're addressing here. So I don't know if you want to incorporate that in your remarks as well. And I will move to, just so the audience knows, we will move to audience questions in about 10 minutes.
So I think that it's important to remember that perpetrators of genocide always see their victims as actually threatening and powerful, right? So the idea of calling Palestinians, and it's clear that by implications, the idea of calling Hamas Nazis is calling Palestinians Nazis, as you just said, Omer, right, is actually a genocidal mechanism. And it's a very, very well-known one, right? That's the way the Nazis saw Jews, by the way, right? As powerful, as threatening, as attacking them, actually, right? So that's one thing to say. And related to that, then I do think absolutely that this Israeli government has a plan. And in a way, it's a plan that all Israeli governments have always had of creating a larger Jewish state, a greater Israel with as few Palestinians as possible, right? In any kind of possible way there is. In, short-term intense violence like the 1948 Nakba, right? The expulsions of 750,000 Palestinians and the destruction of hundreds of villages in the 1948 war, longer term processes of violence, various, mass incarceration, humiliation, sexual assaults, all kind of very well documented Israeli mass violence. And what we're seeing now is part and parcel of this. It is, I really don't think that it has anything to do with revenge. It has something to do with a structural plan of how Israel should be as a Jewish state, right? Now, I do think that it's important to emphasize in this discussion that, I agree with you, Omer, that there's an element of ethnic cleansing, and we know that forced displacement is not listed as one of the acts of genocide in the convention, but there is actually a precedent in the case of the former Yugoslavia where forced displacement could be an act of genocide if it fits the act number 3 on the convention, that is creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group, which is exactly what we're seeing now in Gaza, because it's the forced displacement is happening under conditions of total siege and a carpet bombing. I want to remind everyone that Israel has dropped more than 20,000 tons of explosive on Gaza so far, one of the most densely populated areas on earth, right? That's at least 1.5 times Hiroshima, right? Just a perspective, including the documented use of white phosphorus bombs, right? Everyone should check what that means. There's a reason that they're illegal, right? Israel has killed now more than 11,000 Palestinians, almost 5,000 children, and among them about 1,000 babies, right? That's more than the Russian attack on Ukraine has killed in almost 2 years, right? And I want to remind everyone that in April 2022, President Biden said it was his personal opinion, not the position of the US government, but he said that what we're seeing in the Russian attack on Ukraine is a case of genocide. Now, he said, we'll let the international lawyers decide, right? But it sure looks like that to me. So if we look at Gaza today, right, which looks actually worse than Ukrainian cities under Russian bombings and invasion, well, it sure looks like genocide. And the reason is because it actually is, right? We're seeing, taken together with clear proclamations of intent. And I want to say we have now dozens of pieces of evidence of people with command authority. So I'm not talking about politicians. I mean, Israeli media and the social sphere in Israel, anyone who follows Hebrew language sources knows that it's awash with annihilatory language. Shocking, right? It's on public spaces, on bridges, it's on social media, it's everywhere, right? Talking of people with command authority, state leaders, people in the war cabinet, people, senior army officers, dozens of intent to destroy. Now, I would like to see not someone come and say, this is not intent to destroy, right? But to show how all these proclamations together are not intent to destroy, right? If you take these intent to destroy, which to me is clear intent to destroy, and you add it to the dynamics of violence, right? The levels of killing and suffering, more than half of all the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed right now. The total siege has done what it was designed to do. We know that Gaza is basically running out of food. There's already starvation conditions in Gaza. Palestinians now are living on 3 liters of water a day in Gaza. The World Health Organization recommends a minimum of 100 liters a day. That's for everything, for cooking, for washing, for drinking, of course. Now we're in 3 liters a day. Imagine that, right? Almost complete starvation. Without water, by the way, you can't cook rice, you can't cook lentils, you can't cook these basic foods that will come through humanitarian aid, which is not coming through, right, as it should, right, because there's the total siege idea. So this is indeed, and in addition to that, of course, bombings. Israel is bombing in the south, where it told Palestinians to evacuate, right? I also want to emphasize that, this idea of ethnic cleansing, so deporting people here, we're talking about deporting people to a desert, which is the Sinai Desert in Egypt. Deserts have historically been used as weapons of genocide, right? That's what happened in the Armenian genocide, when the whole population of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire have been, portrayed as enemies and deported to the Syrian and Iraqi desert. Here also, by the way, the Israeli President Herzog, as we all know, have portrayed all the Palestinians in Gaza, the whole nation there, to quote him, are responsible for Hamas, right? The idea of deporting whole populations portrayed as enemies to a desert is what happened in the Armenian genocide. It's what happened in the genocide of the Herero and Nama under German colonial rule in German Southwest Africa, and in other cases. Those things give us indication, right, in addition to the evidence actually of intent and the dynamics of violence, that we are actually seeing here genocide unfold in front of our eyes. And this, I think, leads me in just a few more minutes to two main things. One, which is very important, is that ethnic cleansing is intensified incredibly since 7th of October in the occupied West Bank, right? Where we have now more than 15 whole communities of Palestinians, right? More than 1,000 people uprooted and displaced. This is combined Israeli army and settler violence together. It's always been like that. This is intent. This has become specific, especially intense in 2023, but it's for a long, long time. Now, Hamas doesn't control the West Bank, right? There are no Nazis in that sense in the West Bank, though we see an incredible intensification of ethnic cleansing there, especially in Area C, of course, which is 60% of the occupied West Bank. But there's also a very worrying situation of Israeli Palestinians. Almost 2 million people is Palestinian citizens of Israel. Why is it very worrying, especially if we think in the frame of genocide? Is because the idea that Palestinians now are enemies, which has applied a lot to Palestinian citizens of Israel since the very beginning of the state. These are people who were held from 1948 to 1966 under military rule, right? They were portrayed specifically from the very beginning, basically as potential enemies, if not, real enemies. So the idea that Palestinians in Gaza, all of them are enemies, is easily now in a public atmosphere that is full of incitement and annihilatory language, right? Spreading not only, of course, to the West Bank, but also to inside Israel. We have hundreds and hundreds of arrests, right? An atmosphere of terror. We know that the settler Minister of Internal Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has actually distributed thousands of weapons and set up hundreds of new, quote, self-defense units in Israel, also in the West Bank, but in Israel, right? We all know what these kinds of measures mean. We've seen them also in the past in various cases, right? So thinking about genocide also means that we need to think about actually prevention, not stopping what's going on now, which is incredibly difficult to imagine how that will happen in itself, but prevention in the sense of looking at what's going on in the West Bank and in Israel itself, which is not receiving anywhere near the attention that it should receive. And then my final point is, as you said, about Holocaust and genocide studies. Well, I think that, if we look, as you said, Omer, at genocide, actually, at all kinds of elements, you talked about dehumanization, Omer, as a process. But if we look at genocide also, not strictly in the legal term, but really as a process, right, of destroying a society and a people and a culture, then we could see, longer term processes of Israeli mass violence, right, that feed into this kind of genocidal moment that we've seen now. And in Holocaust and genocide studies, we haven't been, talking about this and treating this anywhere nearly enough. Quite the opposite. There's been silencing, there's been intimidation, there's been rationalization, there's been denials, right? There has been, of course, a special, the special status that Jews and that then Israel, especially, right, as a self-proclaimed Jewish state, enjoys also in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. In other words, what we're seeing now, right, means that some of the professional discourse within Holocaust genocide studies is actually part of the problem, right? And we can't continue, right, in this way, right? There needs to be some kind of accountability of how we've been talking about Israel and Palestine, about documented Israeli mass violence against Palestinians, about apartheid, for example, Omer, that you mentioned, and many other military occupation, the reality in front of our eyes, right? I mean, many scholars visit Yad Vashem for conferences, right? This is all well documented. None of this is secret, right? And yet we've pushed it to the margins quite well in Holocaust and genocide studies, not completely, but quite well. I think this is a major crisis. We also see the way that some some significant Holocaust and genocide studies centers and programs and the statement that I mentioned are now reacting again, erasing Israeli mass violence, actually reaffirming the dehumanization of Palestinians, and so on and so forth. This is a major crisis in the field. We have to deal with it head on. Business as usual in this field is not possible.
Yeah. Thank you, Raz. And Helena, I'm going to kind of turn to you with a related and I think extremely important question, which is about how, in this context and in other contexts historically, especially with your work on the use of Holocaust memory under communism, how the appropriation of Holocaust memory has been used to crowd out reckonings with what actually happened. And this is a question from the audience, how can we address the opportunistic use of Holocaust memory and its abuses, while also being attentive to its genuine influence on Jewish collective memory?
Right, that's a good question. So, I mean, as I said in my earlier remarks, I think we need to separate, private memory, collective memory, historical memory, public memory. These are all very different things, and people can have their own individual memories, family memories that are their own, that are valid, and of course their own memories that orient their lives in whatever way that memory serves to do that, but also particular public memories that are used for political purposes, and those are very often not the same. And so in terms of appropriation of memory, I've been interested in many ways in which different kinds of governments have done it. I've also already mentioned some ways in which Western European governments have used Holocaust memory as a narrative of self-congratulatory identity, that they're the ones who saved everybody, and that's why they also cannot do anything wrong. And this is I mean, Germany is obviously the most clear example of this in ways in which it's the way that it supposedly has dealt with responsibility for a Holocaust makes it much less likely that it will deal with responsibility for other crimes, colonial or contemporary Islamophobia or anything else. But this is the case across Europe. This is the case in Italy, for example, a country that has very problematic ways in which it understands itself as a victim and not really as a country that should come to terms with its fascist legacies. But it also, I think, has a lot to do with other kinds of crimes that are post the Holocaust, other kinds of genocides that have occurred in Europe after the Holocaust, and in ways in which Holocaust memory covers for them. So I've been interested, Raz has mentioned the former Yugoslavia, the region that I know the best, and ways in which the genocide in Bosnia and the ethnic cleansing in other parts in Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo as well, have always been understood by local participants in some ways through the prism of the Holocaust. And this has been very clear in the case of Serbia, which understands itself as, I mean, there's a whole separate, we don't have time to go into this, but there's a whole separate narrative in Serbia that Serbs are like Jews and always been victimized and always been on the kind of, bad side of history, always been victimized by great powers, and how because they're like Jews, because they were killed by the Nazis and fascists and Croatians and everybody else in World War II, this is why they cannot be perpetrators. And this is why they can never accept responsibility for the genocide in Bosnia, especially in Srebrenica, this one particular massacre that's been adjudicated as a case of genocide. And this is similar to what Raz have talked a little bit about in the context of Israel, how victims cannot be perpetrators. And this is, in the context of the Balkans, extremely well documented. And this goes on until today. This colors, for example, Serbia-Kosovo relations, Serbia-Bosnia relations, this idea that since we were victims, we cannot be perpetrators. And it also colors how the language of the Holocaust and the imagery of the Holocaust, and we were put in a concentration camp just like the Jews, and we were tortured just like the Jews, and we were starved, and so you get the image. And that creates a particular kind of politics that, again, is similar to this idea that Raz talked about in the case of Israel, that there's only one response to this, and there's only one response to these kinds of attacks that you perceive are existential, and the only one response that is available to you then is violence.
I just
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to, there's also, I think, a question on that in the chat about Putin's use of Nazis to describe actually Ukrainians, right, and to provide justification for his invasion in February 2022. And I think it's important to put this in this kind of context, right? This kind of broader weaponization of the Holocaust that is really meant to turn create a world turned upside down, right? Whereas if we really think about the lessons of the Holocaust, it's meant to to lead us to think about marginalized, discriminated groups who face state violence, right, and genocide. Whereas in Putin's view, in Netanyahu's view, right, no, what we're seeing is that the Holocaust is meant to legitimize, states as they conduct their assaults against discriminated and marginalized groups. And it's worth remembering that in January 2020, Putin was actually a guest of honor at Yad Vashem, at Israel's main Holocaust remembrance site of the Holocaust. And he used the stage. It was a big conference, of course, about anti-Semitism, but he used the stage in order to distort the history of the Holocaust, to erase the Soviet-German alliance in August 1939, and to portray Ukrainians as primarily Nazi collaborators. That's exactly the justification that he used when he invaded Ukraine in February 2022. So I think it's very important that we look at this not only, there's definitely the context of the weaponization of the Holocaust in Israel, as you said, Omer, and then in other places, as said, Yelena, and the Serbian case, I think, is very, very similar in some ways. But there's also this broader systemic problem, right, where the Holocaust, which of course has become, when you think about Holocaust memory institutes like the USHMM, Yad Vashem, the IRA, right, these are all state institutes, right? So states, of course, have an interest in their interests, right? Which is not the interest of persecuted and marginalized groups. So indeed, what we're seeing now is kind of this world turned upside down, blowing up in our face. It's a major crisis, and one of the things I think moving forward will need to be to deal with this crisis into international legal system, in Holocaust and genocide studies, in other ways.
Thank you both so much. We have a really interesting question from the audience about whether the kind of language around Holocaust trauma and this kind of language of collective trauma, of inherited trauma, has perhaps has perhaps kind of no longer proven useful, and perhaps whether we have to move away from this kind of language. Do we have to redefine this trauma now that we are seeing it being wielded for political ends? Do we need to kind of readjust how we speak about the history of Jewish suffering from this kind of sanctified memory? And a related question also from the audience is about what would an alternative model for thinking about the Holocaust, for studying the Holocaust look like in this moment? So I'm super curious to hear from you all on this question about what this might look like. I don't know, Omer, you were nodding if you want to go first.
Sure. I mean, I think these two questions are related to a third question that I saw as well, which is how do we sort of step away from these cycles of violence? Because what we are talking about is, of course, what many of us have been saying over the years now, that that the perpetrator always sees himself or herself as the victim, and that this sense of victimhood is what actually produces violence. And part of the story that we started this panel off with, the role that the Holocaust plays in Israel, has been sort of giving license to perpetrate violence or to oppress others in the name of your own victimhood. My sense, I want to say something that sounds maybe a bit too optimistic, but I've been thinking about it, and I'm not alone. I've been in a sort of group that has tried to think about this over the last few years, long before October 7th, is that there is another way of looking at it, specifically within the context of Israel-Palestine, where you have two groups. And I spent a long time in the last part of 2022 interviewing many people in Israel, both Jews and Palestinians. These are two groups that over generations have carried with them deep traumas. So this is not just some kind of constructed trauma. It's a trauma that their parents or grandparents had, whether it goes back to the Holocaust or whether it goes back to the Nakba. Of enormous displacement, of cultural destruction, and of the destruction of lives, and then an attempt to rebuild one's lives, and that transferred from one generation to another. So in one way, that's at the core of the conflict, but in another way, it's actually at the core of the potential core of mutual empathy. Because these are, as I said before, these are 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews who live in the territory of historical Palestine, meaning of mandatory Palestine. They have generally not succeeded in living very well with each other, but they don't have any choice because none of them is going anywhere. They're staying there. Some people left, like I did, maybe Raz did, but most are staying right there. And I think that somehow there is another way of thinking about the trauma, even the most immediate one, even the events that are happening right now. And one way that, so this is something that people have been talking about, the kind of that relationship between the Nakba and the Holocaust as two constitutive traumas of these two peoples. But another is also, how do you think about it in political terms? And in political terms, I think there has been talk, and it may seem like a pipe dream, but there has been talk of trying to create, and I saw someone asking about this is why I'm also referring to it, of trying to create some kind of confederation over that territory, which would consist of two states. Those would be independent states. They would have a right of self-determination, and both of them would have the right of return. These are two issues that are crucial, both to Jews and to Palestinians. But the difference between the now impossible two-state solution, impossible because of the massive settlement of the West Bank, is that they would make a distinction between the citizenship and residence. and therefore that people could actually reside in one state and be citizens of another as long as they accept all the rules and regulations of the state that they live in, just like a German citizen could live in Paris and vice versa, but they have to abide by French or German law, but they vote for their own parliament of citizenship. That with when you try to think about that as an attempt to square the circle of two peoples who actually feel a very deep attachment to that same territory. And they share that attachment, although it comes from a different source. It has a totally different historical trajectory, but it is as profound. Maybe if we even begin to think about it, maybe a very different way of dealing with this complete conundrum where you have organization like Hamas that actually wants to replace the state of Israel, and people such as members of Netanyahu's cabinet, including himself, who would like to keep a regime of ethnic cleansing and apartheid going on. And let me just conclude with this, that there has been just now, even yesterday, real Nakba talk among Israeli politicians. The last was a statement saying we are rolling out Nakba 2023 by the minister Avi Dichter. So this kind of talk on both sides, the only way to confront it is to try to think about a very different political horizon.
Thank you, Omer. And just in our last 2 minutes, I want Yelena and Raza, I want to give you each an opportunity to kind of respond to this question of trauma and kind of what an alternative model or even kind of hope for the future might look like.
Yeah, well, I mean, a minute. I think the key here is to understand that these two are, as Omer just said, constitutive traumas that they perpetuate each other, and these events of October 7th and the consequent collective punishment in Gaza are just another step in that self-perpetuation. So obviously that's the bad news. There's no good news, but like I think the step towards something is just simply acknowledgement of two not just traumatic events, but traumatic histories. And I think also acknowledgement of their emotional appeal. I think it's something that often, we talk about, what's according to the Genocide Convention and what's in the Chapter 3, and that's all accurate for us to deal as scholars. But I think at the emotional level, I think you cannot really. I think that's first the acknowledgement of what this means for individual people's memories and for their families, and then moving from that to a sense of public understanding.
Thank you.
I'll just say very quickly two things. One is that I think we need to revisit seriously the idea that the Holocaust was unique or exceptional. This is a key idea that is very much part of all of this story, and it's still, despite a lot of debate and controversy in Holocaust and genocide studies, but certainly outside the academic world, it's still very strong. And it's time that we address this in a serious way, because the Holocaust was not actually unique or exceptional. And I will say this: I think the key, I don't want to say anything about trauma, but I do want to say about, it's very difficult to imagine how to move forward from here, right? Even to imagine, but it has to be based on truth and justice. It has to be based on a truthful reckoning of how we got to 7th of October and how we got to Israel's genocidal assault after 7th of October, and where do we go from here. It's very enlightening, by the way, to see Minister Dichter in Israel, who's part of the war cabinet, by the way, talking explicitly about 2023 Nakba, because Nakba, talking about the Nakba in Israel, is criminalized, right? There's a Nakba law in Israel, right? So we now see Israeli ministers and Israeli politicians actually admit to what's supposed to be criminalized in Israel. And it should turn all of our attention to the significance of finally speaking truthfully and advocating truthfully about what we all know about what led us to 7th of October: Israeli structural and systemic settler colonial violence, military occupation, and siege policies, and what to do now as we move forward in view of this truth. And then, of course, justice, right? There is no future with a genocide government. That's completely illegitimate. That should not even be open to negotiation, just as Hamas could not be part of any future moving forward. So truth and justice, I think, are very significant to the way forward here.
Yeah, well, thank you all. I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you to our audience for joining us for this conversation. Thank you to our panelists for helping us understand this awful moment. And thank you to Diaspora Alliance and to Jewish Currents for convening this conversation. And I just want to remind everyone that you can sign up for both of their newsletters and visit Jewish Currents magazine to kind of follow along on their coverage of events in Israel and Palestine. So thank